The morning fog hadn't lifted when I saw the envelope. It wasn't from a friend or neighbor. It was from a place called Willow Haven Retirement Estates. I held it in my hands like it might crack open something inside me. The paper was thick, the kind they use when pretending care is luxury. I set it down on the kitchen table, next to my chipped gray teacup. The tea inside had gone cold. So had I. I sat in silence, listening to the soft creak of the ceiling fan overhead. It had once been a cheerful sound. Now it felt like a metronome, counting down my disappearance. My name was on the letter. So was Wendell's. He hadn't mentioned anything about a retirement home the last time we spoke. Just, "Don't worry about anything, Mom. I've got you." 3 weeks ago, he stood in this kitchen, stirring cream into his coffee like it was any other morning. He had smiled. Told me to sign a few papers so he could make things easier. And I had. Because I trusted him. Because he was my son. Because I thought love was enough. But that envelope said otherwise. It spoke in legalese. Cold phrases. Transfer of care, long-term arrangements. Financial efficiency. No mention of me. Only of what should be done with me. I looked out the window at the water still, gray, familiar. The bay hadn't changed. But everything else had. In the drawer by the fridge sat my old calculator. Still smelled faintly of warm plastic. I used to run payroll for a shipping firm. I could read between numbers. And something in this plan didn't add up. Wendell had never cared much for paperwork. He barely noticed the framed picture of his father and me that hung above the sink. But now, suddenly, he cared about my future? Or was it about the house? Our home sat on a corner lot. Quiet street. Walking distance to the new marina project. I closed the letter. Folded it once. Precisely. Then slid it beneath the teacup. The cold ceramic pressed down on it like a seal of silence. But my silence wasn't surrender. Not this time. If your child tried to plan your erasure, would you go quietly? Or would you calculate your next move? I opened the cabinet and reached for the tea tin. The scent hit me first bergamot and something dusty, like the inside of an old book. It was the same brand Dan used to bring home from the dockside market. He liked its bitterness. I liked that he remembered. I let the kettle heat slowly. No rush, no urgency, just a gentle groan from the old stovetop, like bones stretching after sleep. The window over the sink was fogged from the steam. I wiped a patch with my sleeve and stared out toward the bay. Mist clung low to the water. The kind of morning that made the past feel closer than the present. On the far wall, the calendar still read March. The square for the 12th was circled, Wendell here, noon. I hadn't had the heart to tear the page. Some part of me wanted to believe that visit still meant something. He'd arrived with cinnamon rolls and confidence. Kissed my cheek. Called me tough as ever. I remember the way he opened every cupboard, as if measuring. I remember wondering why his compliments felt like distractions. He didn't sit. Just paced while speaking about next steps and future planning. As if I were a problem to be solved. As if time had turned me into a math he didn't want to solve by hand. He spoke of waterfront development. Of rising property taxes. Of unforeseen burdens. He said it all gently. Too gently. And then came the papers. They rested beside the warm box of pastries ink beside sugar. Just something simple, he had said. Just legal precautions. I didn't read them closely. That was my mistake. I trusted his tone more than the text. I remember my hand shaking slightly as I signed. Not from fear, just age, or maybe instinct. He smiled when I finished. Told me it would make things easier. For whom, I didn't ask. Now, days later, I boiled water in the same kettle. Laid the same tablecloth. But something had shifted. I sat in Dan's old chair, the one with the worn armrest. The steam from the tea curled into the air like a question left unanswered. I cradled the cup in both hands and let its heat sink into my skin. Even that felt thinner lately. The house was quiet, too quiet. But not empty. Every crack in the wood, every creak of the floorboards, held proof that I had lived. that I had mattered here. And maybe, that I still did. That evening, I brought down the box from the hallway closet. It was heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I was just tired. Inside paper, mostly. Old insurance forms. Tax documents. Receipts from things long gone. But buried underneath all that weight, Dan's handwriting. A folder labeled House, title, Original. And beneath it, a letter I'd forgotten he wrote me the week after we moved in. I sat down on the hallway floor, legs folded the way they no longer liked. I unfolded the letter, careful not to tear the edges. His words were neat, deliberate. Like he'd spoken each one in his head before letting the ink find them. This house is nothing fancy, B. But every nail is ours. And no matter what the world says, this place is not just a place. It's a life. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the paper. It still carried a hint of pipe, smoke, and sea air. I let my thumb rest over his signature. Dan had a way of making even a sentence feel like shelter. I put the folder aside and pulled out the last item in the box. A small ceramic lighthouse. Wendell made it in 3rd grade. Painted it red and white. The top was chipped. He'd given it to me on a day I don't remember now. But the object remained fragile and flawed, but standing. I held it in my hand. And for a moment, I didn't feel 81. I just felt like someone holding on to proof that something mattered once. Back in the kitchen, I set the lighthouse on the windowsill. It faced the bay. The next morning, the wind knocked it over. It didn't break. I picked it up, turned it slowly in my hand. Then, without thinking, I moved the calendar to April. April 3 was already marked. Wendell visit. Below that, I wrote in pen. Look again. Because something inside me had. And it wasn't done speaking. Not yet. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning. Not from Wendell. From Kelsey, his wife. She always spoke with the precision of someone afraid to be misunderstood. But somehow, always left me feeling unsure. Hi, Beatrice. She began, too cheerful. We were thinking it might be time to clear out some of the older things in the guest room. I blinked, looking at the hall door. Dan used to call it the quiet room. It held books, photo boxes, his record player. Wendell's high school jacket was still folded in the closet. I asked, older things? She paused. I mean, if you're still planning to move into the facility Wendell mentioned, it might be helpful to get a head start. I hadn't agreed to anything. Not yet. Not really. But I didn't say that. My silence gave her permission. Kelsey went on talked about logistics, potential buyers for the piano, how minimalist spaces felt lighter. I thanked her. Hung up. Then sat very still in the kitchen chair. The sunlight had moved across the tile floor, casting long lines across the grout. I used to scrub those lines with a toothbrush. Made them bright as bone. I stood, walked into the guest room. The air felt undisturbed. Still carried the scent of cedar and thyme. I opened the closet, ran my hand across the sleeve of Wendell's jacket. It no longer fit him. Hadn't in years. But I had kept it. Just as I kept the chipped mug from his first apartment. And the cracked snow globe from his honeymoon trip to Canada. Things he forgot. Things I didn't. I moved to the bookshelf. Dan's copy of Moby Dick still had his bookmark, a faded ticket stub from a long-gone movie theater. I ran my thumb over the spine. It cracked faintly. These weren't just older things. They were our proof. That we had lived. That someone had loved. That nothing we built had been casual. But now it seemed. Even memory could be reclassified as clutter. I stood there, not touching anything else. The air felt too still. As if the room was holding its breath. Waiting to be emptied. That weekend, Wendell came again. No cinnamon rolls this time. Just a clipboard and polite distance. He arrived around 10, didn't take off his shoes, didn't sit. I thought we could do a walk through, he said. His voice was light. Like we were planning a picnic, not a parting. I stood at the threshold of the living room while he moved from wall to wall. Mumbling measurements, scribbling notes. He paused at the mantel. That mirror might not be safe for the new place, he said, tapping the frame. Dan and I had hung that mirror together our first Christmas here. We laughed for 10 minutes because it always looked crooked, no matter how we leveled it. I like it crooked, I whispered. Wendell didn't hear me. Or maybe he did and chose not to. In the hallway, he opened the linen closet. Took inventory of towels, blankets. The home provides most essentials, he noted aloud. So, we could donate a good bit of this. We? I stood with my hands folded, watching as he boxed up what he called extras. The lavender quilt my sister had stitched. The wool throw Dan used on cold mornings. Even the hand towels with embroidered anchors worn thin, but still soft. I'll label everything, Wendell said. Don't worry, we'll keep the important things. He didn't ask what was important to me. Just wrote it down as if facts could replace feelings. Later, I found him in the bedroom. He stood before the dresser, holding my jewelry box. He didn't open it. Just stared at the lid, blue velvet, frayed at the edges. This could go in storage, he said. I stepped forward. Took it gently from his hands. Set it back on the dresser without a word. He didn't protest. But he didn't apologize either. At the door, he smiled faintly. I'll send over the movers next week. You won't have to lift a thing. I nodded. My throat was dry. After he left, I walked through the house room by room. It felt smaller. Not because anything had changed, but because everything had been touched, assessed, ranked, reassigned. Even me. I walked into the kitchen that evening and noticed the small things first. The ceramic rooster that once sat near the spice rack was gone. In its place, an empty space. Too clean. Too intentional. I opened the drawer by the stove, looking for my measuring spoons. Gone. Just like that. I checked the pantry. Half the jars had been labeled in Wendell's handwriting. A neat row of masking tape and marker. Dry goods, donate. Expired, discard. He hadn't meant harm. I knew that. But harm doesn't always need intention. Sometimes it just needs permission. I moved to the living room. Sat on the edge of the couch. My favorite cushion had been turned inward. The one with Dan's initials embroidered faintly on the corner. That night, I made toast for dinner. A habit left from the early days when money was tight and silence even tighter. The toaster still sputtered. Still popped with a mechanical sigh. I carried my plate to the small table by the window. The seat across from me had always been Wendell's growing up. It still bore the scratch he made with a butter knife when he was 8. I ran my thumb over that mark. It was shallow, but permanent. So many marks like that. Made in passing. Kept in memory. Now he wanted to smooth everything down. To sand the story flat. A week later, I received a group email from Kelsey. It was about family photos. We're planning a wall collage for the new place, she wrote. Please send any high-res versions of old pictures. We're thinking soft neutrals, modern frames. I scrolled through the attached mood board. White walls. Beige tones. Clean lines. No clutter. No stories. I replied that I didn't have high-res anything. Most of my photos lived in boxes. Creased at the corners. Faded from time and sun. Kelsey responded politely. No pressure. She understood. I closed the email. Opened my closet. Pulled down the oldest photo album I owned. There we were, me, Dan, Wendell at the shore, covered in salt and light. I placed it on my lap and opened the first page. The plastic film had yellowed. The edges stuck slightly. But the faces were still there. Still mine. Still real. If your name disappears from the wall, do you still belong to the room? The envelope came on a Tuesday. Plain. White. Unremarkable. But my name was printed in sharp black letters. And that alone made me wary. I brought it to the kitchen table. Placed it next to the sugar jar with the chipped lid. The one Wendell broke when he was 12. Reaching for cookies before dinner. I opened it slowly. No return address. Just a name I didn't recognize. Jeffrey M. Wiles, attorney at law. Inside 2 pages. A letter, and a form titled, Authorization for Conditional Transfer of Property. My name appeared at the top. My address. My lot number. Everything about me measured and monetized. It said I had agreed to a temporary authorization, permitted my son to represent me in pre-sale discussions. My breath caught. The second page was a copy of the document I had signed. Neat font. Legal language. And at the bottom, my signature. Familiar. Slanted slightly to the right. Fading ink at the end. It was mine. Undeniably mine. I pressed my fingers against it. As if touch might change something ink had already decided. A heaviness settled in my chest. Not panic. Something slower. More resigned. The kind of ache that doesn't knock, just moves in quietly and stays. I remembered that day. The cinnamon rolls. The light in the kitchen. Wendell's voice soft, easy. Just a precaution, Mom. He stirred his coffee without looking at me. I signed because he was my son. Because he said I didn't need to read it. Because I thought love could be trusted. But love, it seems, is not a contract. And trust doesn't erase fine print. I folded the papers again. Slid them back into the envelope. Set it beneath my teacup, like I had done with the first one. Then I sat still. Listening. The fan above made its slow circle. The old clock ticked on the wall. The refrigerator hummed in the background. Everything normal. But nothing right. I stood up. Went to the record cabinet. Opened the bottom drawer. The deed to the house was there. Original copy. Filed under D for Dan, not B for Beatrice. He'd been the first name on every document. But he always said this house was mine. I built it for you, he told me once. So you'd never have to ask for space to belong. I closed the drawer. Tighter than usual. This wasn't just paperwork. This was erasure dressed as assistance. I didn't sleep that night. Not truly. The kind of rest I found was thin, like gauze pulled across a wound. At some point, I drifted into the living room. Wrapped in Dan's old sweater. The one that still smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. I sat on the couch and stared at the bookshelf. Not reading. Just remembering. There was a framed picture tucked between the novels. A younger me, holding Wendell on my hip. His fist clutching a spoon. His face smeared with birthday cake. We were standing in front of this very house. The siding still unpainted. A cardboard sign above the porch that read, Home. I hadn't looked at that photo in years. Now it felt like it belonged to someone else. The next morning, I boiled water for tea. The same steps. The same drawer. The same teacup with its tiny hairline cracked down the side. But everything tasted different. Even the silence. At 9 o'clock, I called the number at the bottom of the letter. A woman answered. Young voice. Cheerful. Wiles' partner. How may I help you? I asked to speak to Mr. Wiles. She placed me on hold. Classical music filtered through the line, too soft to soothe, too tinny to trust. When he came on, his voice was brisk, practiced. Ah, yes. Mrs. Holloway. Wendell's mother. We've already begun exploratory contacts per your authorization. My what? I asked. Your signed consent. March 12. Initialed at the bottom. I wasn't told it would be used immediately. A pause. Only a breath long. But full of understanding, he wouldn't acknowledge. Well, ma'am, as it stands, your son is listed as agent for pre-sale proceedings. It's all preliminary, of course. You're still the title holder. Still. That word landed wrong. Like a placeholder for something soon to be removed. I thanked him. Hung up. Then sat at the table, staring at the steam rising from my cup. I had kept this house standing through storms and mildew and mortgage scares. I had paid every bill. Tended every pipe. Learned how to patch drywall when Dan's shoulder gave out. Now, my role in its future had been reduced to a form on someone else's desk. I ran my hand along the edge of the kitchen table. The varnish had worn thin where Dan used to rest his elbows. That mark, like so many in this house, wasn't beautiful. But it was ours. And no one had asked if I was ready to lose it. That afternoon, I opened the drawer where I kept the letters Dan used to write. He wasn't one for long speeches. But he believed in writing things down. There was one note, folded neatly, tucked inside an old gas bill. It read, "Never sign what you haven't read twice. And never forget your name is your word." I held that paper for a long time. Longer than I expected. Then I looked back at the copy of the authorization Wendell had submitted. My name. My word. Used to make things easier. Just not for me. I walked through the house slowly. Not like a tour. More like inventory. There was the water stain on the ceiling from the 2007 storm. We had patched it, painted over it. But it still bled through after heavy rain. There was the nail where Dan's ship lantern once hung. Gone now. Wendell said it was a bit much for modern tastes. In the hallway, the rug was bunched at the edge. I never fixed it. Dan used to trip on it, curse, laugh. I couldn't bring myself to smooth it out. I passed the bedroom, where the quilt lay folded at the end of the bed. The corners frayed. The stitching crooked. My sister made it before she lost her sight. Every item whispered a name. A story. A reason for being here. I walked back to the kitchen. Pulled the deed from the drawer again. The paper was yellowed slightly. My name still bold across the top. I compared it to the scanned copy in the envelope Wendell had sent. Same name. Same woman. But one felt like stone. The other, smoke. I closed my eyes. Listened to the house around me. The floor creaked under shifting sunlight. The wind tapped the window, like a visitor, with nowhere else to go. Then I heard a sound that stopped me. The faint buzz of a text on my phone. I walked over, picked it up. It was from Wendell. Great news. They've already got interest. I'll keep you posted. Love you. No question mark. No pause. Just assumption. Like my silence had become a yes. I turned the phone, face down on the table. Watched the light blink once, then stop. I didn't cry. I just sat there. Hands folded. Trying to remember the last time my name had been mine alone. If someone signs your future without asking, are you still the one who lives it? I packed only 2 bags. Not because there wasn't more to take, but because I couldn't bear to choose. Everything in that house was tied to a moment, a memory, a breath. And how do you fold breath into a suitcase? I stood in the middle of the bedroom, watching the morning light spill across the floor, catching on the worn edges of the rug, the corners of Dan's dresser. The quilt at the end of the bed stayed behind. I touched it one last time, feeling the uneven stitching with my fingertips. My sister sewed it after her second surgery. Said crooked lines were still strong. I believed her. I still do. Irene came to pick me up in her old Buick. She didn't ask questions. Didn't offer advice. Just popped the trunk and opened the passenger door. I turned back before getting in. The porch looked smaller. The house, older. It wasn't the structure that had changed. It was me. I had become untethered. Dislodged from my own story. As the car pulled away, I watched the mailbox disappear into the distance. Dan painted that box blue in 1982. Wendell hated the color. But I never let them change it. Irene's house was tidy. Quiet in a different way. The kind of silence that wasn't earned, just placed. Her guest room was neat, lavender-scented. The sheets crisp. The air filtered and still. I set my bags down. Smoothed the bedspread. Noticed the way the wallpaper curled slightly at the corner by the lamp. That curl comforted me. It was the only imperfection I could find. I sat on the edge of the bed. Hands in my lap. Feet not quite touching the floor. The room smelled of lemon polish and something faintly metallic. It made me feel like I was in a place that expected me to behave. To stay small. To not rearrange anything. That night, I tried to sleep. But the mattress was unfamiliar. The pillow too soft. The darkness too complete. I missed the way light filtered through my bedroom curtains. That soft blue glow that meant I was home. At 2:47 a.m., I got up. Stood by the window, arms folded. There was no bay. No wind through the reeds. Just the fence. And the shadow of a neighbor's porch light blinking steadily like a warning. I thought of the chair by my window. Of the kettle on the stove. Of the creaking step outside the guest room that only I knew how to step over without making noise. I had left those behind. And yet, they still lived. Held shape. Held me. What was I now? A guest in someone else's kindness? Or a ghost of someone no one had asked to leave, but quietly made space for her absence? The sheets rustled as I sat again. My bones ached, not from age, but from being untethered. If I vanished tomorrow, would anything in that house tilt? Would anything fall? The next morning, I woke with the strange sensation that I had slept inside someone else's breath. Nothing in the room was mine. Not the curtains. Not the rug. Not the pale blue lamp blinking softly on the nightstand. Even the silence belonged to someone else. I sat up slowly. The sheets clung to me like a question I didn't know how to answer. I shuffled to the mirror and caught my own reflection. It startled me. There I was, hair flattened, eyes swollen. Shoulders curled inward like I was trying to take up less space. I looked like a woman between stories. I turned on the faucet and let the water run. It smelled faintly of chlorine. City water. Not like home. At home, the pipes clanged once before releasing water. Dan used to joke that the house had to clear its throat first. Even our plumbing had character. Here, the water was obedient. Efficient. Forgettable. I dressed in silence. Pulled on the same cardigan I'd worn the day before. There was a loose thread on the left sleeve. I didn't trim it. Some part of me wanted to be undone. I sat at Irene's table for breakfast. A soft boiled egg, toast without butter, tea from a brand I didn't recognize. She was kind. Asked if I slept okay. I said yes. It was a lie, but one I had practiced for years. After she left for errands, I wandered the living room. Her walls were lined with photographs neatly framed, evenly spaced. But none of them were mine. None of them had Wendell in a swimsuit at age 10. None showed Dan laughing with his eyes closed, or me wearing a sun hat too wide for the wind. I opened my purse and pulled out one photo I had taken with me. Just one. It was Dan, holding Wendell on his shoulders. Both of them wet from the bay. Dan's shirt stuck to his chest. Wendell's arms were outstretched like wings. I had taken the picture while laughing so hard, my hand shook. I held that image now, not for what it showed, but for what it refused to forget. And suddenly, something shifted. Not big. Not loud. But enough. A kind of quiet retraction. As if some part of me curled inward and whispered, "This cannot be the end." I tucked the photo back into my purse. Stood. Breathed. The house around me didn't notice. The walls didn't echo back. But I did. I noticed myself. I took one slow step toward the door. Not to leave. Not yet. Just to see if I could. If being erased is something that happens in silence, can reclaiming begin the same way? I sat by the window in Irene's kitchen, watching the neighbor's wind chime sway without sound. There was no breeze that morning. Just the thick kind of stillness that made you aware of every breath you took. The tea cooled fast in this house. I never understood why. At mine, the kitchen held warmth longer. Like it remembered how many mornings I had stood by the stove, waiting for water to boil while Dan whistled off key. I stirred the tea without drinking it. Irene walked in, her purse already on her shoulder. "I'll be at church council," she said. "You sure you don't want to come?" I smiled gently. "I'm fine." She hesitated, then added, "They're good people. They listen." I nodded again, but didn't stand. After she left, the silence returned. But this time, it didn't press in. It hovered. I walked back to the guest room, sat on the edge of the bed, picked up the notebook Irene kept in the drawer. Blank pages, cream-colored, soft under my fingertips. I used to write. Shopping lists, yes. But also things I never said aloud. Things like, I don't like the way Wendell explains things to me now. He talks like I'm not in the room. Like I'm floating above the furniture, fading. Or, I miss the sound of Dan's coffee spoon tapping the side of his mug. It meant nothing. And yet, everything. I closed the notebook without writing. My eyes drifted toward the window again. Then, down to my hands. They were thinner now. Veins more visible. But still steady. They had typed payroll for 40 years. Held babies. Stirred soup. Signed mortgages. And lately, signed things I didn't understand. I rubbed my thumb over the crease where the skin folded near the knuckle. This was the hand that signed that form. This was also the hand that once tore up a loan offer. When the bank tried to charge Dan extra because we were high risk. Back then, I didn't flinch. I didn't ask for permission. I just knew what was wrong. So what had changed? The woman in that bank office had not needed a second opinion. The woman in this kitchen was beginning to remember her. And she was not done with her yet. I stayed in the guest room after lunch. Curtains drawn just enough to let the soft light in. Dust floated gently through the sunbeam, dancing in slow spirals. I used to clean like mad when I saw dust. Dan called it my battle with the invisible. Now, I watched it and let it settle. Some things didn't need fighting. Some did. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope Wendell had mailed. The copy of the authorization form. I unfolded it again. Read each line this time. Not like a mother. Like a former accountant. The language was deliberate. Ambiguous enough to allow movement. Firm enough to withstand protest. I underlined 3 phrases in my mind. Preliminary negotiation rights. Discretionary authority. Non-binding transfer. Pending review. They were words that looked soft until activated. And they had been activated. I set the page aside. Then stood and opened Irene's linen closet. She kept everything alphabetized. Top shelf. Manuals and folders. I found a small accordion file marked. Taxes, old. She wouldn't mind. She liked to keep things, just in case. I pulled it down, found an old amortization schedule tucked inside from a boiler replacement estimate. I smiled. Most people found numbers cold. To me, they had always told the truth. When people didn't. I spread the papers across the guest bed. My fingers moved instinctively columns, notes, deductions. It was muscle memory. But deeper. It was proof that my mind still knew how to listen. How to see between lines. How to catch the things others hoped I wouldn't. I sat down and pulled my own notebook from my bag. Turned to a blank page. Wrote. Asset evaluation. Holloway residence. Underneath. Estimated market value. 268. 0. Potential long-term care cost. 10-year SES 210. 0. Conservative estimate. Projected property tax increase annually. Plus 4.2%. Then I stopped. Stared at the figures. It was only a draft. But it was mine. Not Wendell's. Not Kelsey's. Not some lawyer's. Mine. And the numbers said something loud beneath the quiet. If my house had value, so did my presence. So did my decisions. So did my name. The woman who once ran payroll for 38 employees without a single late week. She wasn't gone. She'd just been filed away. And I was done leaving myself in storage. That evening, I called Elias Bernard. He was Dan's old friend. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. But I still had his number written in pencil, pressed into the back of our address book. He answered on the 3rd ring. "B?" he said, voice a little gravel, a little warmth. "Yes," I replied. And for a moment, neither of us filled the silence. Then I told him what had happened. The papers. The signatures. The assumptions. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he asked only one thing. Do you want me to look into it? I paused. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I had spent weeks being told what was best for me. Now I wanted to say it for myself. Yes, I said. Quietly. Carefully. But yes. He promised to call back in 2 days. I hung up the phone and let my hand rest on the receiver. The warmth of the call still lingered in my fingers. Then I stood. Went to the small closet. Pulled out my navy coat, the one with the hidden inside pocket. I hadn't worn it in years. Inside was an old stamped envelope. Never mailed. Addressed to a nursing home Wendell had once mentioned. Just in case. I tore it in half. Then again. Dropped the pieces in the kitchen trash. There was no audience. No one to witness the act. But it still counted. That night, I fell asleep faster. Not because I was at peace, but because I was finally moving. Somewhere between grief and clarity. There is a place where a woman remembers. She still belongs to herself. I had stepped into that place. And I wasn't stepping out. Have you ever had to remind someone gently, but firmly, that your story isn't over yet? We invite you to share your moment of quiet defiance below. You are not alone. Subscribe to Kamar FM, where every story is a second chance. 2 mornings after I called Elias, his reply came in the form of a yellow envelope slid under Irene's front door. He didn't call. Didn't text. Just left the paper quiet as a favor between old friends. Inside, a 2-page summary. Typed. Neat. Precise. The first page outlined my current legal exposure. Technically revocable, he wrote, but vulnerable if not addressed soon. The second page held 3 options. The last one was circled in pencil. Full rescission of conditional authorization. Silent, non-confrontational route available via Form 804B. No court. Just countersigned withdrawal. I traced the circle with my thumb. It felt merciful. Not a fight. Not a performance. Just a correction. I folded the pages. Returned them to the envelope. Tucked it between 2 cookbooks in my bag. Irene didn't ask what it was. She noticed my face that morning. Something in the way I buttered my toast more slowly. Or set the spoon down with more intention. After breakfast, I walked 3 blocks to the library. I hadn't been inside since Dan passed. It smelled the same. Cardboard and ink. Dust on jackets no one checked out anymore. The local history section was nearly empty. I didn't come for nostalgia. I came for records. I sat at one of the wooden tables near the window and began pulling property listings, county assessments, development plans along the shoreline. My house was marked as high potential transitional residential. They already had a name for what I hadn't left yet. I turned another page. Found a list of LLCs filing recent land acquisitions. One of them matched the letterhead Wendell's lawyer had used. I didn't flinch. Didn't cry. I simply wrote it down. I was never one for drama. But I did believe in documentation. 3 hours later, I returned to Irene's. A file tucked under my arm. Receipts, notes, printouts, nothing binding. But everything real. That evening, I sat by the kitchen window, watching the bay through the branches of Irene's lilac tree. It wasn't my view, but the quiet felt familiar again. Not because it was home, because it was mine to hold. And I was beginning to hold it differently now. Not as a victim, as a ledger keeper. The balance was shifting, and I intended to record every line. I waited until Sunday to fill out the form. Not because I was uncertain, but because something about Sunday still felt sacred. Even if I no longer went to church. The Form 804B was printed in grayscale. Plain. No decoration. Just spaces to reclaim. I laid it flat on Irene's kitchen table, next to her stack of seed catalogs. For a moment, I just looked at the blank lines. Like they might ask me to prove I was worthy of taking my name back. Then I picked up my pen. Name, Beatrice Holloway. Date, April 23. Reason for rescission, authorization given without full informed consent. I paused at that line. Not because I hesitated, but because I had almost forgotten what it felt like to write a sentence with consequence. My handwriting had changed over the years. A little smaller now, but still legible. Still mine. At the bottom, I signed and dated. No flourish. Just a full stop. Then I folded the paper once. Slipped it into the reply envelope Elias had included. I didn't seal it. Not yet. That afternoon, I made tea. The kind Dan never liked, jasmine, light, floral. I drank it anyway. Let it cool between my palms as I stared out the window. The bay was just visible through the trees. It reminded me that something vast didn't need to shout to be powerful. Neither did I. Later, I opened the folder of notes I'd gathered from the library. Found the name of the LLC again. Wrote it on the outside of the envelope. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. Clarity had its own sharpness. Quieter than rage. But more precise. That evening, I walked 3 blocks to the mailbox. Near the edge of the neighborhood. I passed the playground where Wendell used to climb the metal bars and declare himself king of the sidewalk. The swing creaked in the wind, empty and moving. I dropped the envelope into the blue box. It landed without a sound. No witness. No applause. Just release. When I turned to walk home, I didn't feel lighter. I felt aligned. The kind of alignment that comes when every part of you stops asking for permission. The form was done. The next part would take a different kind of ink. Monday morning, Elias called. His voice was calm, as if he knew I needed time to breathe before hearing the outcome. I've filed the withdrawal, he said. No pushback expected. They were moving fast because they thought they could. He didn't have to say who they were. He knew. I knew. Your authority is restored in full. Quietly, just as you asked. I didn't speak right away. I walked to the window. The light was coming in soft over Irene's countertop. It hit the ceramic fruit bowl just so made the apples look like something you'd paint, not eat. Thank you, Elias, I said. There was a long pause before he replied. You never needed rescuing, B. Just someone to read the lines with you. After the call, I opened my notebook. Drew a new page. At the top, I wrote, Phase 2. Then, beneath it, itemized valuation of what this house has cost me, and what it's worth to them. Not out of vengeance. Out of precision. Wendell had treated my life like a figure to be folded, but I knew the numbers better. I listed the roof repairs Dan and I paid for out of pocket. The insulation upgrades. The custom work on the kitchen cabinets that Wendell said looked too dated. Then I added something else. Emotional cost of removal. TBD. I circled it. Because some things still carried weight you couldn't measure. But you could name them. Irene brought in the mail around noon. She set a crisp white envelope on the table. Return address. Holloway Holdings, LLC. Postmarked 2 days ago. Insidian offer. Formal. Typed. Terms generous in appearance. Urgent in tone. I read it twice. Then I set it beside my own sheet of numbers. Mine was neater. Handwritten. But far more honest. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I walked outside and stood barefoot on the grass. The breeze touched my face. For the first time in weeks. I didn't feel like I was vanishing. I felt visible. And that was enough. For now. The offer sat on the table for 3 days. I didn't touch it. Didn't reply. Didn't even move it. I let it grow stale. Let it feel ignored. The way I had felt. On the 4th morning, I opened my notebook. Turned to the back where I had begun listing numbers. I drew a line beneath the last figure. And wrote one more. Time deducted from dignity, 312, 400. It wasn't an exact number. But it wasn't arbitrary either. It accounted for the cost of a private care facility 10 years minimum. Furniture replacement. transfer fees, stress-induced medical appointments, and a line I labeled emotional devaluation. It was the line I drew boldest. I copied the total neatly onto a fresh sheet, typed it later that afternoon at the library. Elias helped me draft the response. Just one page. No argument. No refusal. Simply, we decline the offer. However, we submit a counterstatement for full financial compensation incurred by premature displacement and non-consensual asset negotiation. Attached. The itemized invoice. No threats. No adjectives. Only truth. And a due date. We mailed it by certified post. I paid extra to request a signature. Not because I needed proof, but because I wanted the pen in Wendell's hand to feel just a little heavier. That evening, I sat in Irene's garden. She planted lavender along the fence line. The scent drifted each time the wind shifted. I looked at the sky. A gray kind of blue. The same color as the walls in my kitchen, the ones Wendell said needed neutralizing. I smiled. Some things aren't meant to be beige. The next morning, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Mrs. Holloway?" a man asked. "Yes. My name's Carter Thorne. I'm calling on behalf of Holloway Holdings. Regarding your correspondence." He cleared his throat. "We'd like to understand if this is a formal legal claim or a personal objection." I didn't raise my voice. Didn't blink. "I believe it's both," I said. Another pause. "We weren't expecting this," he admitted. "No," I said. "I know." Then I thanked him for the call. Wished him a good day. And hung up. The silence after was the most peaceful sound I'd heard in months. Not because it ended something, but because it began to restore what had been taken. Wendell asked to meet for lunch. His text was brief. Polite. Neutral. Like a form letter. "I'll be in town. Would love to see you." I chose the cafe. 1 block from the courthouse. Quiet. Tile floors. Good acoustics for truth. He arrived 10 minutes late. Hair styled. Wearing the same navy blazer he wore to Dan's funeral. We didn't hug. He sat across from me, set his phone face down. "Thanks for meeting," he said. I nodded. Didn't smile. He ordered a turkey sandwich. I asked for Tino food. "I got your document," he said, tapping his fingers on the table. I waited. He looked down, like he had to find his place in a script. "Wasn't expecting it," he added. It felt formal. "It was," I said. He hesitated. Folded his napkin once, then again. "You know I wasn't trying to hurt you, right?" I tilted my head slightly. "I don't think you were trying not to." His mouth pressed into a line. "I just thought if I handled the logistics you wouldn't have to worry." I let the words hang there. Like laundry that would never dry. "I'm not a problem to manage, Wendell." He exhaled. I thought I was helping. I sipped my tea. Still hot. Still bitter. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded printout. The itemized invoice. He placed it between us like a peace offering. "Is this a joke?" "No," I said. "It's an estimate." "Of what?" "Of what it costs to erase someone quietly." He didn't reply. The waitress brought his plate. Turkey sandwich. Side of fruit. No dressing. He didn't touch it. After a while, he asked, "So what now?" I leaned forward. Not to intimidate. Just to be clear. You decide if you want to proceed as my son, or as a business partner. But you can't be both. He blinked. I folded the napkin from my lap, set it on the table. Stood. "I paid the check already," I said. No charge for the conversation. I walked out without looking back. The air outside was sharper than I remembered. Alive in a way the cafe was not. Behind me, a chair scraped. But I didn't turn. Sometimes justice doesn't need a gavel. It only needs the quiet sound of someone choosing to stand. I didn't hear from him for 2 days. No calls. No messages. Just silence. The kind that used to make me uneasy. Now it made sense. Sometimes, absence is the sound of someone rethinking everything. On the 3rd day, I opened the mailbox and found a large envelope. No return address. No cover letter. Just my name. Inside an unsigned copy of a withdrawal statement. A printed version of the same Form 804B I had filed. This one stamped. Processed. Attached was a short note, typed. I understand, W. No apology. No warmth. But no resistance either. I placed it next to the original. Lined them up. Mine in ink. His in resignation. There was nothing more to be said. Later that afternoon, Irene came into the kitchen holding a manila folder. Mail dropped this off by mistake, she said. Meant for you. I took it, opened it on the kitchen table. Inside copies of updated land zoning plans. The block I lived on had been removed from the priority redevelopment zone. I looked for the stamp. It had been altered 2 days ago. The same day, Wendell went quiet. I traced the edge of the map with one finger. My house still stood. Still mine. Not pending. Not provisional. Not for sale. I went to the pantry and pulled out the last of the chamomile tea. Boiled water. Poured slowly. Sat at the table with the cup in both hands. The kitchen clock ticked in time with my breath. I stared at the light coming through the sheer curtain. It moved across the counter like it remembered how to get home. This was no victory parade. No final judgment. Just a woman. At a table. With her name still her own. That night, I took out the ledger again. Turned to the last page. Wrote one sentence in the corner. He did not win. Then underneath it. In smaller letters. And neither did I. But I remained. I closed the book. Let the spine settle. And sat there in the quiet. Until it no longer felt like a silence imposed. But one I had chosen. The sun rose slow over the bay that morning. I watched it from my porch. Not Irene's. Mine. I had returned 3 weeks earlier. Quietly. No announcement. No ceremony. The lock still worked. The key still fit. And that was enough. The house had a layer of dust over everything. I didn't rush to clean it. Each surface felt like a familiar sentence I needed to reread. I left Dan's rocking chair in its place. Even though one arm was loose. He always said it creaked like it had something to say. So I let it speak. I began opening the windows one by one. Letting the air move through rooms that had waited for me. Not empty. Just paused. There was a particular stillness in that first week back. Not hollow. Not hostile. Just aware. As if the house itself needed to know I had come back with a different weight. Not defeat. Not pride. Just presence. I cleaned slowly. 1 drawer a day. Not to purge. But to reintroduce myself. Every object had something to say. I let them speak. The ledger went back to its usual place in the side table near the window. I didn't add to it. Not yet. The tea tin was still on the top shelf of the pantry. A little dusty. Still holding scent. I made a fresh pot the second morning home. Carried the cup outside. Sat in the rocker with a blanket over my knees. From that angle, the bay looked like it always had. Even if the rest of the world had changed its lines. That afternoon, I brought down the wooden crate from the attic. Inside were books. Nautical maps. A few old photo albums with cracked spines and pages that stuck together when the humidity climbed too high. I laid them out across the dining table. Each one a chapter no one had asked to read in years. And yet, I felt ready to open them. Not to explain. Not to prove. Just to remember. By the end of the week, I had cleared the old side room. Dan used to call it his chart room. Though we never had a boat. I dusted the shelves. Washed the curtains. Placed a small sign in the window. It read, Reading Room. Open Fridays, 10 to 4. I didn't expect visitors. But the act of putting the sign up was like taking a breath. I didn't know I'd been holding. Irene came by the next day with muffins. She stood in the doorway and looked around. "It's the same," she said. "No," I replied. "It's mine again." She smiled, then said nothing. And that silence was the softest kind of applause I'd ever heard. The first visitor came 2 Fridays later. An older man with windburned skin and a faded navy cap. He introduced himself simply. "Name's Joseph. I used to sail out of this bay. Heard someone had books." I showed him the room. Offered him tea. He didn't take it. But he ran his fingers over the spines of the old maritime journals like they were sacred. He stayed for nearly an hour. Left without a word. Except for a quiet, "Thank you for keeping this." I didn't ask what he meant. Some things don't need translation. The week after that, a young woman stopped by. She worked for the town museum. Had seen the sign from the street. "Would you ever consider donating any of this?" she asked. I smiled. "Not yet," I said. "I'm still using it." She laughed softly. But she understood. On the 3rd Friday, I found a folded note tucked beneath a copy of Harper's Weekly. In tidy script, someone had written, "I lost my grandmother last spring. This room smells like her. Thank you." I folded the note and placed it in the drawer with my ledger. Not every story needs to be told aloud. Some just need a place to rest. One morning, I woke early. The light came in soft across the floorboards, tracing the grain like a finger across memory. I stood at the kitchen sink, washed a single teacup, let the water run longer than I needed. Wendell hadn't called in weeks. But he'd sent a card. A generic one, blue with gold lettering. Inside, it simply said, "Hope you're well. W." No apology. No update. But the handwriting was his. And for the first time, it looked a little less steady. I placed it in the back of the recipe box. Didn't throw it away. Some bridges don't burn. They just go quiet. And sometimes, that's enough. That afternoon, I returned to the reading room. The window was open just a little. The curtain moved like breath. I sat down with my tea and watched the page of a book curl slightly in the breeze. There was no music. No visitors. No tasks left undone. Only time. And the choice to fill it gently. The sun warmed the room through old glass. The tea cooled slowly. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had become my own inheritance. What does legacy mean to you? When no one's watching, we invite you to share your quiet chapters below. You are not alone. Your story matters. Subscribe to Kamar FM, where every story is a second chance.